Welcome to everyone that is tuning in to our Facebook Live. We're so grateful that you're here joining us on this Wednesday evening. Before I get in and introduce our wonderful panelists for today, I just want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. Welcome to the Malayalees for Black Lives Matter page. Please take the time to like our page because this is where we will be sharing all of the exciting events and contents and resources that we are working on for you guys. Also, please follow us on Instagram because that's where the young folk be. So we're at Malayalees for Black Lives Matter. And without further ado, let me introduce these wonderful ladies I have here with me today. I'm Leah. I will be your host. Welcome. I am one of the board members for Malayalees for Black Lives Matter, and I'm very honored to be doing this here today. So first up, we have Dr. Sunu Kodumthara. She is an associate professor of history at Southwestern Oklahoma State University, specializing in 20th century U.S. history, women's history, and the American West. And then we have Cindu-Thomas George. She is the founder and principal trainer of Shakti Diversity and Equity Training. She is also a professor of communication studies, specializing in intercultural communication, public speaking, and online learning at the College of Lake County. So welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as you all know, our topic today is cross-racial allyship. So, shall we begin?
Sure.
Great. So without further ado, let's start from the beginning. We wanted to lay down the foundation, if you will, since this topic is so important and there's so many different parts and all of us here are learning on how to be better allies. So in order to do that, let's start with this first question, and Cindu, I'm going to direct it at you. And that is, what is anti-Blackness, and how do we see it manifested in our institutions and in society as a whole?
Yeah. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to start with a couple of definitions. And I think in order to understand how to be a better ally and how to stand in solidarity and disrupt anti-Blackness, we really need to understand what it is. And it's complex. But just, by definition, it's both the covert and overt, both interpersonal and systemic racism against Black people. And this type of racism affects the health, the wealth, and the safety of Black Americans. And, I think, in talking about this topic a lot, I've been talking about this publicly before the last 3 weeks, I realized that a lot of people think that this started 10 years ago or when Trayvon Martin was murdered, because that's when we started to talk about things like white privilege and anti-Black racism as a nation. But in reality, this started, in 1619, when the first slaves came over and from Africa. And, before we look at how it manifests, I want to talk a little bit about, in the definition, I talked about systemic and interpersonal racism. And I think just common people who don't study this might not know the two definitions. So I wanted to just take a moment to look at that. So systemic racism refers specifically to the ways in which institutional policies and practices create different outcomes for different racial groups, right? So this kind of racism is built into and baked into the policies, the procedures, and the practices of our system. And it's reflected in the disparities that exist across our system with racial groups. And so we can look at the healthcare system or the education system, the job market, the housing market, media, the criminal justice system, just to name a few. And then we have interpersonal racism, and that is racism that occurs between individuals when one's conscious and subconscious racism is enacted in interaction with another person. And here, some interpersonal racism could look like a hate crime, an act of interpersonal violence, an act of job discrimination, an act of housing discrimination where a realtor or whoever owns the house will say, oh no, this house isn't for rent if you have a Black sounding name or whoever they're trying to discriminate against. And so that's just the definitions. And I think I wanted to take just a minute to talk about how does it manifest, right? What is anti-Black racism? Because right now, a lot of people are just thinking this is only police brutality, but it's not. And so I wanted to give one example to start off with, which is systemic racism in the housing industry, which it looks and shows up in many different ways. But one thing a lot of people don't know is that the Federal Housing Administration in 1934 had $120 billion of loans that they gave out to Americans. And they gave out these money from 1934 to 1962, and 98.6% of the money and the loans went to white Americans, right? And so people of color, who at that time were primarily Black people, did not have access to that. And so they were not able to buy homes and build wealth the same ways that white Americans were able to. And that can help explain the huge wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans. So that's one way. And a couple of more is what we're seeing an uprising about in this country, which is racial violence, police brutality against Black people. And Black people killed 1,098 people in 2019, and 24% of those people were Black Americans, even though Black people only account for 13% of this population, right? Oops, sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. And then in addition to police, killing innocent Black people, civilians also kill innocent Black people. And that's what happened with Trayvon Martin when George Zimmerman killed him, and Ahmaud Arbery were killed by two people. And this happens when we don't check our anti-Black biases, right? And so that's another way. And just a couple of other ones, microaggressions in the workplace manifest, and that's an example of anti-Black bias. And so this happens specifically a lot to Black women, like, can I touch your hair? Or where did you speak? To all Black people, where did you learn to speak so well? We have the maternal mortality rate, which Black women are dying at 3 times the rate during childbirth when compared to white women in this country. And finally, school suspensions. So Black children, Black preschoolers receive out of school suspensions at 3.6 times the rate when compared to white preschoolers. And if you don't have children or you have children that are older, just a reminder, preschoolers are 3 and 4 years old, right? And so these are all different ways that they show up. And then it's so complex because it shows up differently in different communities. So in our Malayali community, anti-Blackness looks different. We're talking about colorism, we're talking about forbidden romantic relationships, we're talking about using the N-word and buying into the model minority myth. And so that's a little bit about anti-Blackness, the definition and ways that it shows up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for breaking that down. I just wanted to ask one question of clarity. When you listed the number of people that were killed and it was 24% of them being Black people, you meant police?
Yes, police killed 1,998 people in 2019, and 24% of those people were Black people, which—
Great. Thank you for clarifying that point, because I didn't catch the police part. Wonderful. So if you don't mind just stopping your screen share real quick.
Yeah.
So Cindu-Thomas really broke down sort of the key vocabulary when it comes in this movement and in the work that we're trying to do. And these are really important to know, especially when you're trying to educate yourself further, and something that we're all still learning and figuring it out. So thank you so much for doing that so succinctly. With that, the other important aspect to all of this is, of course, the historical aspect and the history behind all of this. So Dr. Sunu, I'm going to have you come in here and sort of give us a breakdown of a historical context.
Sure.
And if you want to start your slides.
Absolutely. So let me get this started, if you will. There we go. So really, as Cindu sort of pointed out and hinted at, it really goes all the way back to slavery. And at the heart of it has always been at this at the debate of who is an American. And so I kind of want this to sit in the back of your minds as we go through. But when we talk about our journey to the United States, whether we're talking about our own parents or we're talking about other immigrants, it is completely different to the experience of African Americans, because when you consider their ancestors going all the way back to 1619, those people were not coming with $8 in their pocket and a dream in their hearts. These were people who were coming as cargo in ships with chains around their neck. From the moment they arrived in the colonies, whether it was in what is now the United States or anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, they were known as property. They were robbed of their name, their religion, their culture, their identity in every way, shape, or form. They had no personhood. They were property, and that was it. And that's their status for 246 years. And so for those individuals who argue, why can't Black people get over slavery? That was 400 years ago. Keep in mind that this is an institution that lasted for 246 years, as far west as Texas, as far east as Florida, and as far north as Maryland. And it did not end until 1865. So for generations, this was a long-lasting institution. And by 1865, we have over 4 million people affected by it, right? So for most of my presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on Reconstruction, which for many of us in American history is the most pivotal time, because our reset the United States. It's our chance to really become who we're supposed to be as Americans, to really establish and fulfill the promise, the great promise of the United States. And in some ways, we almost get there, especially if you look at the legislation passed during this time. So there are 3 legislative acts that are passed and then ratified, and that's 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So you can see there, the 13th abolished slavery, the 14th established citizenship, and the 15th granted the right to vote. Now, the 3 of these things, as I've listed there in smaller writing, are a bit problematic, had loopholes, and were limited. And hopefully during this conversation today, we can talk about those things. But in the immediate, they were paradigm shifting, particularly for African Americans who took those opportunities and ran with them. As the pictograph shows you right there on the screen, these were men who served as a part of the first Black delegation to Congress. African Americans, as soon as they gained the opportunities, took their rights and ran with them. They voted, they ran for office at the local, state, and federal level. They opened businesses, they established their own land ownership, they sought out educational opportunities. So they were not passive victims by any means. But the key here is that while they sought out opportunities to define themselves as Americans, white Southerners in particular had a very hard time with that. And so the white response to Black American status was violence and intimidation. So you have the establishment of things like the Ku Klux Klan in 1866, which was primarily designed to be a violent and intimidating group that expanded out of Tennessee and throughout the South. Then you have the return of a minstrel character known as Jim Crow. It started out as a character in the 1830s, it died out in the 1840s, and it came back in the 1870s because it actually made white people feel better. White people were nervous about the success of Black people, and this character made them feel more comfortable. And it made them feel like this is what Black people were supposed to look like, act like, and dress like. And it also helped them feel more justified. The combination of Jim Crow and the KKK justified their actions in pursuing other actions that robbed Black Americans of their rights, such as their right to vote through things like disenfranchisement, when they exercised things like the poll tax, the literacy test, things that made sure that Black Americans were not allowed to use their political voice. And then, of course, there was segregation. This is the front page of the Daily Oklahoman. This was 2 months before Oklahoma was granted statehood. At the state constitutional convention, what they believed would be the most progressive constitution in the country, the first laws they passed were segregation laws. And as you can see from the cartoon, you have 3 Black children next to a little white girl. And as it says, "Have you a daughter, Mr. Voter?" Implying, of course, that the little white girl was in danger from being around 3 Black children. And finally, one of the most well-known white responses was violence through lynching. Now, lynching, of course, is the murder of a citizen for alleged crimes without due process. But one of the things that we don't remember or realize is that lynching is about control. It's about sending messages in a way to maintain power. When we talk about lynching, one of the things you should remember is that people would also find ways to use lynchings as a means to not just punish Black people, but to remind themselves of their own positions of power. So they would take photographs and then create postcards. These 2 postcards were from the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. These were 2 photographs taken after the Black neighborhoods had been completely destroyed, and then they were made into postcards. Typically, when Black men, women, and children had been murdered, they would have white people standing in front of Black bodies, take photographs, and then send those as postcards as well. So the white response to Black empowerment was to basically say, you're American, but you're not as American as we are. I'm going to turn it over to Leah.
Thank you, Sunu. If you could just stop your screen share real quick. So thank you so much for providing that historical background. A lot of this is stuff that, you know, tends to get glossed over when we're learning this era of history in schools. So it's always important to kind of go back and figure out those key moments and do that work. So thank you. You did such a great job. There's so much history to cover, as we always talk about. But this kind of naturally lends itself to our next question, which is, what is the history between South Asians and the Black community? And do we have even a history of allyship? I would like to answer that for all of you. So the very first South Asian actually arrived in the late 1700s. That's our first record of South Asians coming to America. By the late 1800s, approximately around 1870s, the population started quickly expanding. People had been here for a while. They started establishing themselves, marrying, having children. As all us Thaysies know, this is what we do best, establish communities. Because of this rising in population, you know, there was a very strong reaction from white America, as you can imagine. And Dr. Sunu, if you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So one of the things that, well, I gotta, hold on, let me see if I can share this again. So one of the things that I want to show is the response to the Indian population. So this happens actually in 1907. Let's see if we can work on this. Here we go. So in 1907, there was a news article released about the Indian population coming into or having arrived in the United States and Canada. Indians had been blamed for a meningitis outbreak, and there had been a Methodist bishop, a guy named James Coburn, I believe, and he had spent some time in India, and basically he said, well, the Indians were escaping their country because there was a big plague there, and they brought the germs with them, and they must have infected us all. None of this was scientifically proven, of course, because who needs science? Hashtag 2020. So there's no scientific study to prove it. And so naturally everyone believes him, because who doesn't believe the Methodist bishop? And so there's hysteria in the United States and Vancouver. So you have more articles that are published like this. And I wanted to read a quote from one of them. The article that's entitled, "Have We a Dusky Peril?" Included this quote: "The Hindu is not of us and can never be. He brings nothing to our country but diseases and filth and a little labor, in return for which he subtracts some of our capital." And with that gem, I return it to Leah.
Well, like Dr. Sunu said, there was this increase in outcry against the presence of South Asians in America. So the way, as all democracies work, the citizens turned to their government to resolve this issue and handle it for once and for all. So the US government, in response to this outcry, passed the Immigration Act of 1917. This act did two things. First, it banned any future migration of South Asians into America. Mm-hmm. The next thing that they did was that they essentially denied citizenship to any South Asians currently within America. And one of my favorite or disturbing factoid about this legislation, which is written on taxpayer dollars and can be seen at the Library of Congress, should you ever wish to go over there, is that the legislation says Indians are the equivalent of alcoholics, beggars, and the insane, and they're undesirable to ever receive citizenship. And that's very powerful. That's a very powerful message. Mm-hmm. The government essentially said, America essentially said, we don't want South Asians. Mm-hmm. So overnight, an entire population instantly became illegal, you know, and due to this, the only community that offered them any refuge or a safe space were African Americans, because who better to understand their plight than those that have been going through this for much longer than them. And there's this beautiful history of fellowship between South Asians and the Black community, a lot of which remain unknown to us. In fact, one of the first Indian restaurants was opened in the 40s in Harlem, and you can still visit it today. And it was started by a Bengali, and it was known for a place where Malcolm X would come and enjoy biryani, and revolutionaries, and they would come and talk about how to become liberated. And it's in many ways a place where a lot of movements that we saw in the 50s and 60s start. So we go back a long time with the African-American community. They were our refuge, they were our safe harbor, and they helped navigate things for us until 1965, which is when the Immigration Act of 1965 was passed and what brought all of us here. But, you know, I always like to bring up this fact because it is important to know your history in order to understand why we're called allyship. So I think this kind of segues into our next segment, and that is, why is it that we have a responsibility as Malayali Americans to be a part of this movement and to become allies? So Cindu-Thomas?
Yeah, well, thank you for setting up that beautiful history. I think it is so important, and I learned some new things. But I think, you know, before I answer that question, I want to set up the stage for who we are as Indian Americans, right? You know, within the Indian American community. And so there are over 4 million Asian Indians that reside in the United States, and we're the third largest immigrant group after Mexican and Chinese immigrants, but we're the fastest growing. We also have the highest educational attainment when compared to any other ethnic or racial group in the United States. And we have the highest median household income when compared to all other ethnic and racial groups in the United States. So Indian median household income is 100,000 or just a little bit over, and this is significantly higher than the US median household income, which is $63,000, and it's even higher than white American household incomes, right? So we have the biggest buying power of all Asian Americans at $283 billion of buying power. And so the reason why I wanted to kind of set that up is because as a collective, right, we're part of this Indian community as Malayalees, and as a collective, we are a populous, a powerful, a educated, and a wealthy group. And together we can really make a dent in the fight against anti-Black racism. And because of all the history that was set up, I feel that we have a personal responsibility to do so. And so regardless if your family immigrated here, you know, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, or yesterday, as a community, we have all both directly and indirectly benefited from the centuries of Black Americans who fought for us. And you know, due to the civil rights, you know, we arrived, our parents, our grandparents, ourselves, we arrived to a country that allowed us to have opportunities to succeed, to live the life of privilege and comfort that most of us do. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons. And, you know, and also we have race privilege, right? Because we are South Asians and there is a racial hierarchy in this country, and we're not on the bottom. And I think we should use our race privilege to uplift the communities that are not being privileged right now. And lastly, just because, you know, if you care about justice, equality, or humanity of everyone, then you should care about disrupting anti-Blackness and help eradicate it. So those are some of my thoughts.
Well, very well put. I think it's also important for us to understand that as a community, we do have a shared history of oppression. You know, India was colonized for 200 years by the British. You know, we were treated that like less than second-class citizens in our own homeland. And a lot of us have grandparents and even parents that remember that period in our history. And we too went through the freedom struggle and the demand for our country back and for our equal rights. So we should be able to relate to African Americans and their struggles, because they did not come to this country by choice. As Dr. Sunu said, they were brought in shackles and chain and made into property. And their battle has been a long and hard one. So it's always important, it's important to recognize that sharedness, because it helps you to connect with them more, you know. But Dr. Sunu, did you have any thoughts on sort of?
Yeah, I think we are too quick to try and separate ourselves and try to sort of keep our heads down. I think we as a community have a tendency to wrap ourselves in this bubble and say, well, my job is to get up in the morning, go to work, hustle, pay my taxes, and just do that. And that's enough, you know, take care of my kids, take care of my business, and be done with it. And we take, and also, you know, we take great pride as individuals as calling ourselves Americans, and that's fine. But the reality is that because of our skin color and because of our racial identity, the truth is that historically we are Americans with an asterisk. That's how we are viewed. Unfortunately, it's not fair and it's not right, but this is our truth. This is our reality. And until we step up and we take an active charge in ensuring that all people of color, including our Black brothers and sisters, are treated fairly and equally by this system, then this is how it's going to be. You know, I think the problem is that we have, because we have separated ourselves and we have sort of said, well, that's their problem, it's their issue, we have ignored it for too long and not realized, no, that's our issue too. The asterisk belongs to us just as much as it belongs to them. And that's what's been happening.
I love that, Americans with an asterisk. I will be borrowing that phrase from you. Oh, sorry, Cindy.
Oh, I
Yes.
just wanted to kind of reiterate what she said. And, you know, we, at some point, we can't just fight for our own people, right? If we want racial justice in this society, we have to start working on behalf of other groups and not just ourselves. So I think, yes, I've heard, well, the Indian people experience racism, and Black people have killed Indians, and why should we be fighting for them? And I think it's just, if we're going to really strive for racial justice and racial equality, it has to be a multiracial effort, and everybody has to be involved, including South Asian people.
Well, that perfectly sets us up to tackle our next question, which is, we decided that we were going to take 3 common arguments that us collectively and people in the group have been sharing, which is arguments and criticism we keep hearing from families and friends and peers against this movement and against the stand for solidarity. So why don't we start with the first argument, which is, why can't African American people be more like us? We were immigrants and came here without knowing the knowledge, came here with $10 in our pocket. So if we can make it, why can't they?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't, who wants to go?
I'm sorry, I meant Cindu-Thomas. Go.
Oh, I just think that ignores the centuries of systemic discrimination that exists. That's real. You know, it's not something that's made up. Black people were not able to write and read. It was illegal for them to write and read. They had to be in separate school systems that oftentimes were not funded, which is still the case today. I mean, you look at all the different, roadblocks that African American people had to get through, and a lot of them have gone through that. You know, they're the most resilient racial group that exists because of everything that they've gone through. But history impacts the present, right? And so that history of oppression has impacted the disparities that they exist. And so instead of trying to fix Black people, which is what I think a lot of Malayalees, still are in that mindset of, we got to fix Black people, we got to change them. We had to fix their racist, corrupt, broken systems. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of my answer to that is, yeah, we didn't have to experience that. We came to an America that was more tolerant of us. I'm sure that most of your parents, like my parents, experienced racism as well, but it was in no way, it was probably more interpersonal, right? Indian people have experienced some levels of systemic racism with the Punjabi, Sikh, and some other communities as well, but not in any level that you can compare our racism and systemic racism to Black American communities. So we had the upper advantage, and that's why we succeed.
That's very well put, and I will be using all of these points in my future arguments. Dr. Sunu?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, listen, everything that we have faced was certainly traumatic in its own ways, and I'm not dismissing that at all. But when you compare our experiences to experiences that have lasted and been traumatized over the course and repeated over the course of 400 years, and then on top of that have been denied at the highest levels of government, when you have officials at the highest levels of government repeating over and over again, there is no systemic racism. Systemic racism is not a problem. It does not exist. It's like you're beating your head against a wall and saying, no, it does. Somebody help me. If that's being denied and ignored, then we're
100%. So. I completely agree. And also, I want to point out one thing. The Immigration Act of 1965, which is what brought most of us here and what started off our migration back into this country, was specifically designed to only bring in South Asians with an education and can serve a purpose. So those that migrated under that act came with a job opportunity because they were in need. Then when you think of the chain migration, which is their siblings and nephews and nieces that they brought over, those folks came to a support system. They came to a family that was already established and had a network. And, there's that concept of the immigrant resiliency. When you've chosen to leave your homeland and everything you've ever known to go to another country, you have made the decision to make it no matter what. So whatever you've have to face in your new land, you're going to face and you're going to conquer and you're going to be successful because you have no other choice. But we were given this wonderful community of support because, you know, we are so community oriented. Everyone helps everyone else out. Even to this day, my father-in-law, like if he wants to get something fixed on his car, he will still go to the Malayale owned car shop over the one that's 2 minutes from our house, because that's just, you know, their mindset of we have to help each other, we have to stick together, we are all each other has. So that's a big support system that African Americans don't have, because not only do they have institutions and laws against us, you know, they're facing a lot of divisions in everyday life. So these are some, oh, I'm sorry, Cindu-Thomas.
Like jump in there, you know, anti-Blackness lives within the system of whiteness. And when we arrived here, we didn't have a system against us. There wasn't an anti-Indian system, right?
Right.
And we align ourselves as a community, I think, in my opinion, more with whiteness than Blackness, right? Because that was, you know, subconsciously taught to us that, you know, there was anti-Black racism that existed in the 60s and the 70s. And so we saw that and we're like, all right, we're gonna be more like the white people, right? And so that also helped us, you know, get in and be accepted. And, you know, I don't know, Sunu, if you're a Christian or not, but a lot of Malayalees are Christian. And Christianity is also another way that we are benefiting from whiteness, because we're part of the dominant religious group. Being Catholic and being raised Catholics, you know, that allowed me to fit in more, right? So my Indianness and my xenophobia was one thing, but hey, she's Catholic, so she's more like us, right? So we were able to fit in more when we came here as well, and benefit from the system of whiteness that disadvantages Black people.
Yeah, that's very well put. So hopefully we gave you guys some points to counter this argument. So let's move on to the next common argument, which is George Floyd is a criminal. And in general, African Americans tend to lean to be more criminal and violent. So why should we support George Floyd? Why should we even bother aligning ourselves with this community? So Cindu-Thomas?
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the subconscious anti-Black bias that we consume. And so, you know, stereotypes, prejudices, biases are a lot of times learned subconsciously. And so, you know, are Black people really all criminals? And when we say that, we're saying that all Black people are a homogenous identity group, and that's not true. You know, racial groups are not homogenous, they're heterogeneous and they're dynamic, just like Malayale people are not all the same. You know, we have Malayale people that are criminals, we have Malayale people that are murderers, we have Malayale people that are amazing, church-going, loving people. And so I think we have to really get away from this blanket statements, because that just perpetuates anti-Blackness, which in our position, we should be disrupting it instead of perpetuating it.
Yeah. And then Dr. Sunu, could you kind of speak to how the history of violence that African Americans have kind of lends itself into transforming them into the enemy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is where lynching comes in, right? I mean, this long history of, you know, white mobs being able to go in and sort of exercise their own brand of vigilante justice, being able to go to jails, being able to go to homes and kidnap Black people, men, women, and children, mind you, take them from their homes, torture them, and then murder them and get away with it. Whether we're talking about George Floyd or we're talking about Emmett Till, these were people who were taken from their homes, taken from wherever, and then murdered. And then what ends up happening is you sort of wait for some kind of punishment, some kind of justice, and unfortunately it never comes. The story of Emmett Till is especially haunting because Emmett Till was 14. He may or may not have whistled at a woman. We know for certain he never touched her, and yet that's what she claimed. And the next thing you know, his body is at the bottom of a river. And these two men who were accused of murdering him were found not guilty. A few months later, they were paid $4,000, confessed to the crime, and they lived their happy lives until they die several years later. And that was it. And nothing is done of that. And there are thousands of stories like that.
And the person who accused Emmett Till on her deathbed admitted that she made it up.
Yeah, admitted
Yeah.
that she made it up, and she's still hanging around. So
I wanted to say one more thing is that, you know, a lot of this, even in my family, is on George Floyd. This uprising is not happening because of George Floyd. This is the tip of the iceberg. And yes, maybe George Floyd had a criminal past, but Botham Jean did not, Ahmaud Arbery did not, Trayvon Martin did not, Breonna Taylor did not. I can go on and on and on and on. So this is not about one person. This is about the execution and the persecution of innocent Black people that are dying for no reason other than they have Black skin, right? And so just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and share something that I recently heard. I believe it was Deepa Iyer that said it. She said, violence doesn't need a perfect victim, because nobody should be a victim of violence. So regardless of George Floyd's quote unquote criminal history, he did not deserve to die being suffocated to death by the knee of a police officer. You know, Dr. Sunu, I interrupted you.
Well, no, I was actually, that was the point that I was going to make, Leah. To add to that, you know, if we are going to present ourselves as this society of law and order, hearing, then that means that, you know, a person is arrested, that person has a right to an attorney, that person has a right to a trial by jury, that person gets to go through the process, the criminal justice process. That's what that means. Not that a person has to then be arrested and a police officer is then the judge and the jury and the executioner. That's not how that works in this country. That's what the Constitution says, and that's what the laws say. Right. Unfortunately, though, if you're Black in this country, that's not how it's worked.
I hear you. And I just want to touch on this concept of African Americans being more criminal. And I'd like to use marijuana as an example. So Black people and white people consume marijuana or use marijuana, whatever the correct terminology is, at the same rates. There is very little difference. But Black people are 3 times more likely to be convicted and go to prison if caught in possession of marijuana. And that lends itself to this mass incarceration of African Americans, which they make up 13% of the population. Well, African American men make up 13% of the population, but they make up 40% of the prison population. So the majority of them are sitting in jail cells. And that is because the judicial system has consistently over-punished and over-criminalized them. For the same crime, a white person can expect a slap on the wrist, a little probation time. Very rarely do they receive jail time. And we see this over and over and over again. So like Dr. Sunu said and Cindu-Thomas mentioned, the system that's set up is racist and it's set up against them. And so when you hear these arguments of, well, they're so prone to criminal activities, they're not prone to it. They just get punished more severely when caught for it. So that's something that could maybe help you. But if no one else has it.
Piggyback,
oh yeah, go ahead.
They get punished more, they get arrested more because of unchecked anti-Black bias. That's really why they're getting stopped more and all of that. So,
yeah, exactly. And that's a great point. So let's move to our third argument, which is all lives matter. So why just focus on Black Lives Matter? And Cindu-Thomas, you mentioned you had a great analogy for this.
Yeah, and I'm just going to share my screen and really. Oh God, sorry. Okay. So this is something that is, I hear it a lot. I hear, you know, I'm a professor and I work in a predominantly white institution. So we're having lots of conversations about this. And I think it's really important for us to stop saying all lives matter, because it ignores the system of whiteness that exists in this country and also the centuries of racial inequality that African American people have endured. So we have a racial hierarchy in this country, and Black people are at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. And because they've endured, you know, centuries of systemic and interpersonal racism, you know, when their lives matter and they have equality and freedom, then all of our lives will truly matter. And so I always say that all lives will matter when Black lives matter. And if you have a hard time understanding that, that's because this really feeds into the process of equity. And, you know, equity means giving people what they need to be successful, even if it means giving more to those who come from less and those who have been marginalized and oppressed, and giving less to those who have been more privileged, right? And so we need to be giving more care, more concern, more, you know, attention to Black lives right now, because they are under, their lives have been under attack, right? And if you have a hard time understanding this, and I'm a mom of two, so I'll just use a child analogy and then I'll show you a cartoon. Imagine if one of your kids had a chronic illness, right? And they were really, really sick. Would you say, well, all my kids matter, all of their kids, they matter, so I want to pay equal attention to all three of them? No, you're probably going to give your sick child more of your attention, more of your care, more of your time, and more of your love in that moment that they're suffering, right? It doesn't mean that you love your other children any less, or you think your other children are less important. It just, you're acknowledging that one of your children is suffering and you need to treat them with a little bit more care. And that's really what this means. And this is a cartoon that I don't know where I got it from, but chainsawsuit.com. And it's two people saying, well, I think all lives matter. We should care about exactly equally at all times about everything. And then you have two houses, one that's burning and one that's not, and you're watering the house that's not burning as much as you're watering the house that's burning. And so I think it's really important to understand that when we treat everyone equally, it doesn't lead to equity. And in a system that is rid of systemic inequalities and racism, we can't just treat everyone equally. We need to apply the process of equity, which is saying Black Lives Matter, not just saying it, acting upon that, giving them more resources and access and opportunities right now than other racial groups so that they can advance in a way that they have never been able to, and we have been able to.
Well, very beautifully said. And I like the comic strip. That might be a good WhatsApp forward for all the
yeah.
all of the WhatsApp groups that are very lit these days. Dr. Sunu, do you have a supporting argument to help folks?
Well, I think there seems to be this genuine fear of the word equal, like the idea that giving Black Americans rights or giving them extra things, I don't know, or more things would mean that we're taking away rights from other groups. As if we're going to a bank and there's a big pile of rights, and somehow giving them those rights or taking away rights from other people. And that's not how this works. And so I think what people need to understand is that these are rights that are inherently supposed to be for all people. What's happened, though, is that these rights have been denied those people over the course of hundreds of years. And so if you are actually having this argument with your parents, your uncle, your auntie, whatever, I think you've got to make sure that you choose the right word. And the right word is that they have been denied these rights consistently. And that's why their lives matter right now. Because they have been denied, we need to make sure that they are now being granted. And we have to do our part for that.
Yeah. And I just want to share a sort of perspective on this. You know, when we're saying Black Lives Matter, it is because that they are facing death at a much higher rate than all of us sitting here. Black people are 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police. 3 times more likely. And notice I said Black people. I didn't say poor Black people. I didn't say criminal Black people. I didn't say uneducated Black people. Just Black people. So regardless of how many degrees they earn, if they drive a nice car, if they're just walking in their own neighborhood, they are seen as a threat, which means their lives are always at stake no matter what. And there's absolutely nothing that they can do to change the color of their skin, which is what this policy and this outlook is based on. And, you know, the fact that we can enjoy walking around in a neighborhood without fear of being pulled over or being accosted, or if I get pulled over for a speeding ticket, I'm just really worried about what my husband is going to say versus what this cop is going to do to me. You know, like, we don't share those fears. And because that's their reality, that is why their lives matter right now until they don't have to have that as their reality. So, you know, that could.
You reminded me of the grandfather who was paralyzed because cops said there was a skinny black guy walking around. And so it's not, you know, we're not, you know, we also could be targets. And I have, you know, and their skin is darker than some of my black friends, you know, so we can be mistaken by ignorant people who have lots of, you know, racism against black people. So we have to also consider that too. It's only happened once nationally, but you never know, right?
Yeah, you never know. And the case that Cindu-Thomas is referring to is that of Suresh Bhai Patel. And the only reason the cops approached him was because someone said that it was a skinny black man walking the neighborhood. If they had known he was Indian, would they have even called the police? You know, that's a big question to ask, but he was mistaken and now he's paralyzed, and that cop still walks free with no repercussions for his actions. So, you know, it can be us. It just happens to be them right now. So we have to fight for them in order to protect everyone. So hopefully that gave you guys that are tuning in some helpful arguments to make and some support. And let's sort of move on to this whole concept of allyship and how we become allies. And sort of, we wanted to focus on maybe 3 things that we can all do in order to be better allies to the Black community. But why don't we start with what the core cause of Black Lives Matter, or what the core point of all of this that we're doing is. And it's basically, we're trying to center on dismantling anti-Blackness for Black people. So Cindu-Thomas, you want to expound on that a little bit? Because you kind of...
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is, so the goal of being in this group of Malayalees for Black Lives is to center the health, the wealth, and the safety of Black Americans, right? And to protect them and to advance them. And so it's so important not to center how anti-Blackness shows up in our community, right? And so there is a time and place for talking about colorism and experiences with being called karata, or, you know, whatever, karami, or whatever it is. There's a time and place to talk about, you know, the pain that we felt when we brought home our Black boyfriends or Black girlfriends, you know, and the model minority myth and all of that. That's important, but that shouldn't be louder than what we're doing to fight anti-Black racism and how it shows up for Black people. And I think that's really important. And as somebody who's just been on Instagram and looking at all these South Asian spaces, I think so many people are talking about colorism. That's not going to do anything to change the realities of Black people.
Yeah, and that's important to know, because I know everyone wants to just kind of create relatable points to the Black experience and their own, but right now is the time to just focus on them and what they're going through, and listening and, you know, supporting, you know, that is the biggest role in becoming an ally. But let's talk about like 3 tangible things that you can do. And let's start with examining your own anti-Blackness. What are your thoughts on that, Cindu-Thomas?
Yeah, I think examining your own anti-Blackness is so important, because it has been designed so carefully into the DNA of this country that we hold anti-Black biases without even being aware of it. We consume it, we ingest it from our peers, from our families, from our education, from our medias. And so it's so important to take a step back and reflect on your life, you know, do an inventory. How are you contributing to anti-Black racism? You know, what are you doing to check yourself? And I think one of the things is work on your anti-racism, think about it, read materials. But one thing that you can do right now is head over to Project Implicit, Harvard's website, and you can take the implicit association test that's focused on race. It takes 5 minutes and it's free as a starting place, right? But you got to be honest with yourself, and that takes courage, that takes looking in the mirror, and that's a little uncomfortable, but we have to be willing to be uncomfortable if we're going to see change, right? So that's a little bit what I have to say about biases.
Dr. Sunu, because, you are a professor of history, where do you see, obviously our history is riddled with anti-Blackness, but how do you suggest you tackle that when we're trying to learn and kind of decode all of that?
So one thing I think we have to do is we have to be honest about our history. And this starts with parents. When you send your kids off to school, because the school's textbooks are not going to talk about history the way that history actually happened.
Yeah.
So I would encourage parents to start buying books that actually examine African American history, that talk about Black Americans and their contributions to history and that sort of thing, and be willing to talk to your kids about it. And talk about how Black Americans are just as much a part of and contribute to American history as white Americans do, and do the same for Native Americans and other races as well. I mean, make it as multiracial and multicultural as this country really genuinely is. Because if we start from the beginning like that, by the time they get to college, it won't be as shocking as it is right now when I get to my college freshmen. And they won't be as surprised as they are when they come up to me and say, wait, what do you mean? So if we can start earlier, I think we can have a better chance at really sort of reclaiming our country's history and understanding fully who we actually are.
And I wanted to add, there's a great resource by the Tutu teacher. I have it on I have like a resource guide for South Asians who want to fight anti-Blackness. I think they'll pin it on the page. And it's a Tutu teacher who's a kindergarten teacher out of Brooklyn. And she does a fantastic job in 5 minutes in a YouTube video talking to children about anti-Black history or just racism and slavery. So I recommend checking that out to any parent who's out there.
Great.
I will send it to my nieces and nephews. And guys, if you're worried about missing out on the resources listed, don't worry. We will be linking them and providing access to all of this as soon as the live is over. So just make sure you like the page so that you can see it there. And Dr. Sunu, I loved what you said about reclaiming our own history. It is so incredibly important. So let's talk about another tool that we can utilize in becoming an ally. And that's rooted in courage. And that's the courage to call out and to address casual racism or microaggressions that you see. So maybe Cindu-Thomas, you can kind of touch on what microaggressions would be, what that kind of looks like when you're calling something out.
They're just everyday slights, that add up, and they create racial trauma and stress for people. Indian people experience microaggressions, women experience microaggressions, LGBTQ plus community, and so it's not specific to Black people, but when you're hearing like the slights in your family, like, oh, your hair looks like a carabin or something like that could be an example of a microaggression. Stop and ask, well, what do you mean? Can you explain that? Do you know how problematic that is? And so I think I have a family that I have been talking a lot to, and on WhatsApp and my cousins, and it is uncomfortable. It's awkward. As South Asians, we're collectivist people. We tend to want to shy away from conflict. And so we kind of just say, okay, whatever, and look the other way, but this isn't the time to do that, right? So I think it's important to use your voice and start immediately with your family, right? With your community, with your churches, with your immediate friends. And to think that people in our generation, and I know, Leah, you're 10 years younger than me, and I don't know how old you are, Sunu, but we're all similar age, and to think that there is no anti-Black bias or racism in our generation is just a crock of crap. Because if you just look at the Malayalees for Black Lives pages, you'll see it come out, within people of our own age. And so it's even talking to your friends, not just your parents, not just your grandparents.
Right. I mean, I was going to say, just today they announced the whole thing about Aunt Jemima and the outrage that Jemima won't be on the bottle. My God. what am I going to do about my pancakes? I mean, and no one understands the history behind the image and all of these little things. But if we just take a moment to call those things out and just explain, listen, because I know you, I understand your intention, but here's why that's problematic. And there's a way to do that where you can still be friends and you can still be okay with each other. But it just takes that moment of courage where you just have to call it out and be kind, but be courageous and say, this is something that we have to address because it's not right. Yeah. And as long as it continues, it is an energy that is being put out into the universe. And as long as it's being put out, that means that it's going to continue on. And if it continues on, then that ugliness is still out there and that ugliness will continue to exist. And then I'm going to be a part of it. I will be someone who helps to contribute to it, and you don't want to be a part
of it.
And
as a practical guide, there have been a couple of South Asian folks have posted, here's how to talk to your South Asian family, and I have 2 of them on my resource guide, and that I found really helpful, which breaks it down. So there's lots of free things out there that can help guide you in your conversations with your family and help guide your courage. So that's
yeah. I've actually used one of those that you posted in your resource guide in a conversation recently, and it was very helpful. The other aspect I want to touch upon is calling out our peers that still use the N-word. It needs to stop. Like, you need to stop. Let us make today the day that you decided to stop, because it's so problematic and it is uncalled for, and it's something that, you know, people have taken, you know, I always like to say this, and this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but South Asians, we love Black culture, we want Black swag, but we want none of their problems. Yeah. So if you want to use that word, then you need to be ready to deal with what comes with using that word. Yeah. So, and I already know you don't want that problem. So just maybe let's stop using it.
And words don't belong to everyone. And that has, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates has a really great video that I could share, and you can put on the page, and it explains why people who are not Black should never say that word. Right. And, you know, we all belong to out groups and in groups. And as Indians and Malayalees, we do not belong to the Black American group. And just because you have one friend that says, oh, well, that's cool, you can call me the N-word, doesn't mean that that's okay and that's going to be okay with other Black Americans. Because remember, there's 40 million plus Black Americans, right? So it's really important to stop saying that. And if you don't know why and you want more, email me or message me. I'll explain it more.
The Ta-Nehisi Coates one is great. I send it to everyone I know that still uses it, because I'm like, you need to watch this. It breaks it down. But let's also talk about the last thing as allies that we're called to do, and that is to engage politically. You know, this is a movement, not a moment. And for any movement that's rooted in righting and injustice and equalizing the playing field, you know, there is a goal. There's an ultimate goal. And that goal is creating permanent change through policy. So, Cindu-Thomas, could you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, you know, I think that the whole goal of activism is policy change. I mean, I don't think that, I know that. That's actually a fact, right? So like, rioting and protesting and, you know, all of these things that we're doing is for the purpose is to change anti-Black policies and laws. And so it's really important to think about what you're doing and where you're putting your support and your time and energy. And I think one of the best things that you can do is either get involved with, support, or donate one of these organizations that are directly working to change anti-Black policies and laws and change the people in power who are supporting the anti-Black policies and laws. And again, I have some organizations on that list, but Color of Change and the Freedom Project and the Black Future Lab, I forget the name of it. There are at least like 4 or 5 nationally, and there are also local ones as well. If you don't want to give your money to the big national ones, you can look at what's happening in your local communities to help advance Black people and their lives and experiences.
That's great. That's very helpful to think about. Dr. Sunu?
Well, what I would encourage is vote, and then vote some more. You know, a lot of people are convinced that the only elections are presidential elections. but the ones that really count, the ones that really matter, are the ones that are happening locally. Your local elections, especially your state and your local city elections, are the ones that are going to matter to you the most, because these people are making the decisions that affect you literally every single day. And the other thing that I would say is, in addition to voting, if there is a space where you feel like you can fit in and you can make a difference, run. There are plenty of people who are capable of leading, capable of contributing, a space where your voice should be heard. And yet, for whatever reason, we shy away and we think, I don't think so. What can I do? How can I? That's for you. You are just as much an American as everybody else. I don't care what the asterisk says. Get in there and say something and do something. That's your kid's school. That's your tax dollars. Get in there and do something. I think one of the key things that we have to learn is that if we don't step in and occupy the space, somebody else will. And we've got to get in there, and we have to step in and fight for ourselves and for fellow people of color, especially for our Black brothers and sisters. And if we don't, no one will.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And, I work for an elected official, and I'll tell you guys this little insider knowledge. If we get 5 or more emails or phone calls on a particular topic, we have a meeting about it, like a full meeting, because that's how little it takes to get our attention, because so few people will reach out. And I just want to use New York State as an example, which is where I reside and the government that I work for. In reaction to George Floyd's murder, there's been all of this call for police reform. And the citizens of New York decided that they want police reform. And when I tell you, in 1 week, we got, I want to say 300,000 emails, 300,000 emails. And we're just a state senate. Like, we're just the state senate and my office, one senator whose constituency is not even 8,000 people. We got 300,000 people telling us we need these reforms passed. We want them now. And guess what happened? In 48 hours, they were all passed. And nobody played politics on that one, because they understood the majority wanted this. And that's the power of your voice. And that is why you need to reach out to elected officials. Yes, Dr. Sunu is right. You need to vote. 2020 is the most critical election year. I will be saying this until I'm blue in the face. And not just the presidency is up for grabs, but every layer of government. And police and schools, which is where we need the most amount of reform and focus, is all decided on the local level. It's decided by mayors, it's decided by school boards, it's decided by county supervisors, all of which election cycles, their election cycles specifically, have the lowest amount of turnout because nobody knows, nor does anyone care. Okay. It's not as glamorous as, a presidential year, where there's Air Force One landing places and rallies and things like that. As someone who works for a local official, I know how hard it is to turn people out for our campaigns in comparison to like a Congress campaign, because that's glamorous. But the real stuff that's decided is all on the local level. So start by finding out who your elected official is, and you can use Ballotpedia for that. They're great. You enter in your address and they will list every single elected official on every single level of government. And they'll tell you if they're up for re-election. So.
And I wanted to add, vote for people who are pro-Black, right? Not just not racist, like they didn't get in trouble, but anti-racist and pro-Black. Yeah. If you're trying to uplift Black Americans.
Yes, exactly. So when you're looking at candidates or you're looking at current sitting officials, take a look at their track record or take a look at their platform. I trust and believe everybody will be making clear their position on this come the election cycle. So ladies, thank you so much for all of this. I hope those that tuned in found this really, really helpful, because I certainly did. I learned a bunch.
One really quick more thing that
yeah.
I think is really important is that we need to work on developing our own anti-racism as a community. And you know, I've been doing anti-racism work for a long time, and I know a lot of white folk, a lot of white communities are working together to disrupt their own racism and, you know, be in tune with it so that they can change. And so I think that as the South Asian community, we need to do that. I know Leah, the Malayalees for Black Lives Matter, is starting a book club for Ibram Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. And so I'm really excited about this group because this provides a vehicle for us to do this work together. And so I really implore and ask all of you to take that step to start developing your own anti-racism, because that's one way that we can really stand in solidarity with Black Americans.
Yeah, Cindu-Thomas provided a perfect segue for me to plug our book club. But one of the first initiatives that we're launching is a monthly book club focused on key books that help you become better allies. And the first book is the Ibram Kendi one. We will be setting a date to have a live discussion for those that read the book. We're setting a deadline for when you need to read it by, and then the date to join the discussion, and we'll have a list of questions, and we're so excited to see you all there. But again, you have to follow the page in order to know about these things, guys. So please follow. So we're going to take the next like 10-15 minutes or so to just answer some questions that came up. So let me just pull it up here. I'm told there's like a little bit of a lag on Facebook. So if you guys are not getting this clearly, we've recorded this Zoom call, so we will be posting it in its entirety, and it's been smooth sailing for me. So hopefully it's gotten better over there. But someone asked about comparing systemic racism and the caste system that we all come from. So is there any points of comparison? Does one kind of help explain the other? Your guys' thoughts?
So I read a little bit about this, and I think, you know, I'm in a couple of different South Asian spaces where people are talking about this, and somebody said, if you're not talking about casteism, when you're talking about anti-Blackness in South Asian communities, you're doing it all wrong. And, you know, for me as a Catholic, that's not something that comes up for me. And Sunu, are you Hindu or Christian or?
I'm Christian, yeah.
Okay, so all three of us are Christian, and so it's not something that I think has been pervasive in our lives. And it's good to remember that not all Indians are Hindu. 80% are, but not all of them are. But I do think there is a definite correlation because, you know, there, just like I said a couple of times today, that there is a racial hierarchy in this country, right? And Black people are at the bottom, and there's nothing that they did to deserve that. And similarly, caste system, they have a hierarchy in, you know, their society as well, where Dalits or untouchables are at the bottom and Brahmins are at the top. And the difference is that within the Indian caste system, the spirituality is involved, right? And in the racial hierarchy in the United States, there is no spirituality involved, but it's very similar.
Gotcha. Dr. Sinu, thoughts?
I mean, yeah, beyond that, there's really not a whole lot that I can contribute. There are similarities, but beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, casteism is interesting because it's interesting to me that neither of you have really experienced it, but maybe it's the region from which my parents come from, but it is a very prevalent topic. And I've heard it a lot. And there's this sort of pride that a lot of Catholics have of being Brahmins that converted versus like a lower caste. Like everyone's really quick to claim that lineage, even though by all historical standards, they most likely would have been lower caste folks because Christianity appealed to them more than it did to Brahmins. Because Brahmins were already in a position of power, you know. So there is that sort of narrative of casteism within the Christian community, but that's just something I've just personally experienced. I think my community is very heightened to that, but you know, it does kind of it kind of also explains why we so quickly distanced ourselves from African Americans, even though prior to, most South Asians that were in this country were closely linked to that community. And that is because we come from that history of casteism and colorism that allows us to accept that racial hierarchy with no questions asked. Like, oh, okay, I understand. You guys have a structure. Great. I come from a structure. I can find my place here. And Cindu kind of mentioned it, we all strive for whiteness because they're seen as top of the pyramid. So casteism is a great way to use to explain to your parents this concept of a racial hierarchy, because that's probably where a lot of them get confused. And by comparing the two is a good way of approaching that argument.
Yeah.
And then someone else asked, the school to prison pipeline. Can we touch a little bit on that?
What about it?
It wasn't a specific, it was like, could you guys talk about this? I guess what they're probably meaning is, why is it that more African-American kids end up in prison versus their white or non-Black counterpart?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not prepared to speak about that completely, but I can talk about it a little bit just from my experience in education and being a professor and doing some of this work. If you remember what I talked about with the loans, right? The $120 billion of loans being for 30-something years being given to white Americans and not Black Americans. Well, if you look at the outcome of that, if you are not building wealth at the same rate as white Americans, and you are not going to be able to provide for your young the way that white Americans were, right? So they weren't able to, they had to work 2 and 3 jobs. They weren't able to raise their kids probably in the same way that white Americans could. And ultimately, they weren't able to send their kids to college because it costs a lot of money to go to college. And this is generalizing, right? This isn't every single Black person in this country, but you have a huge disparity of who's going to college and who's not because of the wealth gap, right? So that impacts so many different aspects of our society. And the graduation rates, even though all groups are graduating at higher rates, the gap between Black and white students have actually grown in the last 30 years, right? And so there is a lot of reasons for that. The out of school suspensions from a young age, you're learning to not trust your educators because they're suspending you when you're 4. The dress code policies in schools also disadvantage Black girls disproportionately. So you're getting in trouble because your bust is falling out of a tank top, where the white girl and the Asian girl don't have boobs at 5th grade. And then you're learning to, again, not trust educators, right? And so it's a system that really disadvantages, people from the age of 4. And that could be one reason, right, that people are not, the school to prison pipeline. So you drop out of school because, you're getting racism, anti-Black bias, systemic, racism from the age of 4. That other groups are not getting, right? And there's so much more to that, but I just will speak to those points.
Dr. Sunu?
I think Cindu knocked that one out of the park. I'm not even going to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, guys, if you're also looking for more understanding on like the school to prison pipeline, 13th is a great documentary, and they do actually address this very clearly. So I would recommend checking that out. I'm sure it's all over social media to watch 13th, but I'm going to keep plugging it anyways because it's great. And then someone asked about harsh policing. Why is it that African Americans receive so much harsh policing? Why is it almost militarized against them?
So, well, I can talk about that.
Sure.
So when we talk about the history of policing in this country, policing gets its start as slave patrols. That's the origination of policing in this country. And it sort of evolves from there. When we talk about the evolution of policing, it evolves in partnership almost at the same time with the evolution of the Klan. So you'll have these groups that sort of work in partnership and would protect groups like the Klan and other white nationalist groups that would come up and would help sort of enforce their actions. And at the same time, when you would have, so I mentioned the 13th Amendment earlier, the 13th Amendment, speaking of Ava DuVernay's documentary, The 13th. In the 13th Amendment, it mentions this phrase that slavery is abolished except for involuntary servitude, which would mean prisons. So what would end up happening is if someone was arrested and then taken to prison, that person could then serve their time as punishment. So then you would have these police officers or these correction officers going and arresting these people, and then those people then paying their price, serving their time as essentially enslaved people. So the system has essentially continued from slavery to present day. It's just that the titles have changed in a certain way. That's the difference, and the uniforms are different. That's pretty much it. So there's been an evolution, but the titles are changed. That's all, and the weapons are different, and things have been militarized in the meantime, and the budgets have been way expanded. That's what's happened.
I also think that, and that's a great historical, background that I think a lot of people don't know, but I think one of the reasons why there's such harsh policing against Black people in this country is because of unchecked anti-Black biases, right? And just not doing the work. And that's why now a lot of, police are doing implicit bias training and anti-racism training so that we can start to unlearn and uncover our own racism, so that when you're in a position of power with a gun and you're scared for your life and you've been taught subconsciously or consciously that Black people have a gun and they're going to kill you back, you're more likely to use your gun to protect yourself, right? And so it's not that, I don't want to get into the police, conversation, but clearly not all police officers are bad or racist, right? And, I think it's something that it's an unfortunate, because there's so much anti-Black bias, Black people are being killed, Black people are being targeted more than other groups. And that's how one of the ways that I approach that question.
Well, in addition to that, to kind of piggyback on your comments, Cindu, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, when you have more policing areas where more Black people and Hispanic people live, of course you're going to have more crimes there. Of course you're going to see more acts of violence there. There are more police there to find out more acts of violence and crime there. Of course there are. And so then you have skewed statistics, you have all of these different issues that come up. And so things are a little bit more problematic in that way, in how people interpret the statistics that way. And so things get a little bit more problematic, and that's also contributed to the difficult relationship between the police, and especially the police in the Black community. So that hasn't helped either.
Well, I think you guys definitely answered that question. So with that, we have no more questions. First and foremost, let me thank you ladies for taking the time to do this with us. We're so grateful and appreciative. And, we did run over a little bit, but I felt the points that we were all making was so important. So, it's okay. We went a little bit over. But for those that tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. This Zoom has been recorded, and we will be posting it as a full video on the page. So if you were experiencing a bit of lag issues on the live, don't worry, you are not going to miss anything. We'll make sure that you'll get to see the parts that I guess had a little bit of a hiccup on the Facebook side of things. But on here, it went really smoothly for us. So I apologize for any technical difficulties. But with that, I hope, you guys all join us on our collective journey towards allyship. Dr. Sunu and Cindu-Thomas did such a great job helping lay our foundation for us, and now it's time for us to do the work. Please tune in next week. We will be announcing what our panel will be about in a couple of days, so stay tuned. And ladies, have a great night. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in.
And bye.
Bye.